Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gean Moreno. I'm the director of the Knight Foundation Art and Research Center at ICA Miami. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to Cultural Memory and and Contemporary Upheavals, a conversation with Lyle, Ashton, Harris. Um, so first, I think a little bio introduction of Lyle. Born in the Bronx in 1965, Lyle was raised in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, New York. He attended Wesleyan University, Cal Arts, and the Whitney Independent Study Program. With a practice that ranges from photography to collage to installation and performance, his work has been exhibited at the Guggenheim, the Pompidou, the Whitney, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Migros Museum in Zurich, and many other venues. He has participated in the Venice Biennale, the Busan Biennial, uh, the Biennial Sao Paulo, and the Whitney Biennial. His work is found in the collections of MoMA, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum, the Guggenheim Museum, Studio Museum, the Hassel Museum at Bard College, Tate Modern, the Walker Art Center, um, among many other institutions, and now at the ICA Miami, which we're very excited about. So this year, we kind of, with Lyle, we worked on doing a presentation of the Ectochrome Archive, which here are some installation shots of this show at the ICA, which I think looks quite amazing. And just a little background on the Ectochrome Archive before we get going. It's a collection of photographs that Lyle began to shoot in 1988 and shot till about 2001. And what I think is really interesting and important about them is they capture a moment of cultural production when a new generation of African American thinkers and artists were coming of age, and this happens in the wake of the AIDS epidemic and the crack epidemic, and a changing economy where industry is going away, and in its place what we're getting is these terrible crime bills that will create mass. So when we started contemporary moment we're in and just the social upheaval that we're seeing, we thought it would be really nice to think of this, what I call, for lack of a better term, from a cultural studies perspective. So thinking of a moment, taking the more anthropological side of the archive, where all these seminal and conferences from the early 90s were documented, conferences like Black Nations, Queer Nations, Black Popular Culture, and a number of figures like Stuart Hall, et cetera, et cetera. So we can get into all this. This was just a little primer to get us going. And so one of the things that I wanted to start with was this image right here, which I think it shows Lyle's work with Lyle's work in it, in a kind of mise en scène kind of production. I think it just gives us an opportunity to talk about what got us here, what happens before the archive. Maybe Lyle, you could say something about your education, and how do we get to 1988? How do we get to archive?
Okay. Firstly, I would like to thank Eugene for inviting me to take part in the exhibition. And we had first met, I believe it was at the Whitney Biennial that Chris Lou and Mia Locks curated. I think it was 2000, and my dates are off, 2017, wasn't it? Yeah,
Yes.
2017, where you were a consultant for on the Biennial. So that was, I would imagine, your first experience with the archive. Am I correct?
Yes,
Saying
with the
that?
archive, yes.
Yeah, so I just want to I think it'd be, just for the audience, since we all are, I assume, sheltering down somewhere, is that I'm super excited about this show, and I'm looking forward to seeing in the flesh. And it seems odd, but I guess for all of us now, globally, but I'll talk to myself as an artist, having been invited to take part, in this, take part in this exhibition, and having not seen the exhibition itself yet. So I mean, so I just wanted to sort of say that, just to ground us in terms of the specificity of where we are. So so can you repeat your question for me, please?
Oh yeah, I was just wondering if you'd give us a little bit of background, how we get to 1988 and the archive. There's a history of photography in your family. There's your education. By the time, you start making the archive, you've already kind of generated a first body of work that has gotten some attention. So I just a little background.
Okay,
Fill in.
and I think I want to just digress for 1 second before I do that. I mean, clearly there is the main emphasis, if you will, as you mentioned, is Black or African American culture producers in the archive. But I think what's particularly special about the archive that it captures a period of time where there was a multiplicity of identities that shared a similar or same social spaces. If you think about the Black Popular Culture Conference, that was, a collaboration between the Student Museum and the DIA. I mean, that was the first of its kind, where the center left, critical theorists, artists who were actually looking at Black culture as a site of exploration. So I think it's important to talk about so to the degree there are Black culture producers, there are also people like Douglas Crimp or Kathy Opie. So it is that complexity of the multiplicities of sexualities, identities, and ethnicities that occupy, the archive. So I think it's important to say that. So yeah, I grew up in the Bronx. Grew up in the Bronx primarily. I lived in Dar es Salaam as a child. After my parents divorced in the early 70s, my mother took my brother and I to live with her. She was a chemistry professor, and it was early 70s, so post civil rights. A lot of Americans, specifically African Americans, were on the heel of civil rights, were felt in a way to broaden their peer view, and was to maybe also be of service to the continent that was on the heels of several example of various independence movements were happening. And my mother had applied for a job to teach in Tanzania. And so we lived there for a couple of years. And so it cannot be overstated or overspoken how impactful that was, or formative that was for me and my brother as a young child, from the Bronx, African American, to be in an African country, with an African president, who was super progressive, et cetera. So then I moved back to New York. I did my undergraduate studies in Wesleyan, and I went to my grandfather, he was a systems analyst at the Port Authority, but he also shot over 10,000 Ektacomb slides documenting his friends and family, et cetera. In fact, his archive that my brother and I inherited formed the basis of my first show called The Good Life, that was at Jack Tilton Gallery in '94. From a young child, there was always, a camera present. In fact, there's a running joke among my grandmother's three daughters that the level of time it took for my grandfather to compose that image, because in retrospect, he was very much involved in the idea of framing, not only just in terms of framing the Black family, but also literally in terms of formally how he wanted to somehow compose his work, his images, et cetera. So it's an archive that my brother and I inherited, and he was just one of several photographers in the family, I should say. So in fact, the portrait that was used for the invitation card for my '94 show was by P.J. Johnson, who was the firstborn of that generation, of my generation, who died in a tragic car accident. But I actually live now with several of his vintage portraits he did, very beautiful black and white portraits he did of the family, including portraits of my brother and I. So should I talk some more? So
And then you go to Wesleyan and you go to Cal Arts. Maybe just the atmosphere.
Okay, well, the atmosphere.
Yeah, the atmosphere at Cal Arts, and then you go to the Whitney, and
Well, I mean,
what is
I
that?
think okay. Well, I think specific questions would be helpful, but because I think that would be helpful. But I could talk a little bit about was an econ major at Wesley, and I went to grad school. Was an econ major. I dropped out of school. Went to visit my brother in Europe. Wanted to be eyes on prep. The story came back with orange hair. I dropped out of Wesleyan, took a photography class in the city, French class, then went back to the Wesleyan to finish at the econ major at the time. If you were a POC, particularly African American, yeah, and for my particular, background, you were given a couple of choices. It was directed. You could study medicine, law, economics or accounting, what have you. So it was my South African stepfather. My mother married wind up marrying a South African revolutionary who was very much involved in the African National Congress movement. That in fact they met in the early '70s prior to her leaving for Tanzania, and he had left. He's a subject of my brother's film, The 12 Disciples of Nelson Mandela. He left South Africa after the burning of the passes in '59 with 11 other guys and traveled from Bloemfontein to outside of Dar es Salaam, where the armed ring of the ANC was being formed. So it was he, my South African stepfather, who actually encouraged my family to let me do what I wanted to do. Hence, I went back to school and finished up the major in studio art with a focus in photography. Um, and it's interesting because going from Wesleyan to, let's say, Cal Arts, where the program at Wesleyan is much more of a modernist, if you will. Taking photography with Cal Arts is very much as post studio. I remember a professor, dropping, while looking at some of my work, dropping smoking, he accidentally dropped some ash in the photograph. So it very much was a post studio. It was very much also a program that was influenced by, you know, um, Marxist thought, feminist, scholarship, etc. So I was very much that was sort of the surrounding that was sort of the environment in which that I was thrusted into. While there, um, I did have a difficulty adjusting at first, I should say, and I think it was I what happened. Because one photographer who was a professor there, John Bach, who he just encouraged me to just continue start shooting. So I just started in a tradition of my grandfather, and I had been making, let's say, more formal portraits, I should just say, that were, as you know, the America series that were done as part of my undergraduate thesis at Wesleyan. But parallel to that, I've always been like taking snapshots, if you will. As far back as I can remember, there was always a camera, and obviously, marrying my grandfather, in terms of shooting a lot of Nectochrome, shooting black and white, etc. So the Ectochrome archive, in a way, pulls from that tradition, that trajectory that did not sort of come into light, if you will, until, let's say, in 2014. But that has always been an impulse, the documentary impulse to the work itself. So when I got to Cal Arts, I think it was meeting. I remember I met Bell Hooks. So she was doing a 1 week workshop. She had been invited by Catherine Lord, um, photo theorist, feminist scholar, who was she wasn't the dean. She was the head. She was the head of the art school, director of the art school at the time, and so I did a course with Bell Hooks that was loosely based on her book Talking Back. So that was very instrumental for me because I think while at Cal Arts, I was not, although I went to Wesleyan, I was not versed, if you will, in the postmodern discourse and theory that was the language in which a lot of the discussion was happening at Cal Arts. So I felt, in a way, alienated from that. So it took me a while, and it was a rich, complicated, but deeply generative experience. But it took me a while to somehow to find my footing, if you will. So I think, in a way, by meeting people like Bell Hooks or Isaac Julian, John Comfer, Isaac Julian, Marlon Riggs, Alexis Hemphill, who visited the school with the exception of Essex Hemphill within the first year, that was very instrumental in terms of giving me another angle, if you will, and in a way that there was, as they say in Brazil, as my brother had, well, it was Brazil, I heard someone say it, I mean, a cara, I mean, that's my face. There's something they saw inside of me. So in a way that the camera was a way in which I recorded, those lived experiences. And I don't know, it's curious because why was that? What was the need, if you will, to somehow to document, to capture? I you know I guess intuitively understood that there was something that was happening here, or just the idea of mirroring what I had saw from my grandfather in terms of that one sort of creates. And but there was a certain sense that there was a certain sense of maybe urgency and yeah. So
Yeah, and I think so. Here's Cornel West and Marlon Riggs,
this was at
and
the Black Papa
yeah,
Culture
yeah.
Conference.
I,
Yeah,
I just wanted to get to the bell hooks one since
yeah.
you mentioned her. But Africa then also plays another role with the archive, if I understand the narrative of it correctly, in that you started building this archive, but it was always kind of your personal thing, and then you yourself go to teach in Africa, and it is there that, or when you return from there, that you actually start understanding it as a public project that needs to be exhibited and presented. Is that kind of the
Well,
correct narrative?
it's an interesting narrative. It's an interesting, interpretation of it. Yes, I lived in. How much time do we have? Let me just so I can talk at length. What are we doing in terms of time? How much time do we have?
So we have about, I would say, something like 32 minutes, something like
Okay,
that.
great, good. Okay, yeah. So in 2005, I got invited by the then Vice Provost Sharon Yarko, who was an economist and Nigeria. He was a Ghanaian Ashanti economist at NYU, as I mentioned, the Vice Provost, and he at the time NYU had campuses, globally, as you know, London, Paris, I believe Tel Aviv. Um, Several other places. And there were a few professors, namely Manchi Diawara, Awam Ampa, I think also Debrilis, who felt that it was essential to have a campus on the continent of Africa, that is. So I was invited I met Yao, and my good friend Nancy, who's in the archive as well, I've known for many, many years. She thought, given my experience of having not only lived in Tanzania as a child, but also grew up in the Bronx in a family that was deeply invested in the African National ANC struggle. In fact, at any given time, anyone who has gone on after Mandela was political office have actually been in the house that I grew up in the Bronx, as well as students, et cetera, exiles, et cetera. So to invite me to go there for Ghana to help to develop this program there, art program. And so one semester I fell in love with the people, the culture, and someone, and one semester became 7 years. And it was a very deeply rich experience. And I essentially I was either getting ready to go to Ghana, or I was actually returning from and, decompressing. So it was always that 7 years were years that I was very, very much orientated, towards, living abroad. And it was a rich experience. I mean, obviously there have been generations of, let's say, African Americans who have gone. If you think about, most famously, Du Bois, was invited to by Nkrumah. He actually was interned there. Upon my return in 2014, the ending of a relationship, I happened to coincide with a friend, Isaac, asking me to use some of my snapshots to illustrate his monograph to accompany his 10,000 Ways at the Modern. And namely, he was looking for an image of the great Stuart Hall, and other people such as Kobe Mercer, etc. So I had, prior to leaving for Rome in 2000 for the Prix de Rome, had deposited all of these images in my mother's house in the Bronx. Everything else went into storage. And so upon bringing them back to the studio in Chelsea, it was almost being confronted, like, with the past. I mean, I should just segue and say that Ghana, my experience in Ghana was I was a professor, but also around the art center. I had a very public life there. I mean, I was obviously representing NYU, but I was also very much engaged, let's say, in the contemporary Ghanaian art scene. For example, the Day Center that I ran the Day Center, which is based on a private collection of the leading private collection of African art, in one of the ones in West Africa. In fact, the great Eleanor Tsui gave us a print in honor of, to support the library that we founded there. So I had a very public life there. So coming back from that very public life to New York, grieving a relationship that was ending. And I was confronted with this past of this trove of images that captured a life from, let's say, 20 years ago. And so it was a period of, let's say, what do I do with these images? I mean, scores of images of beaches, former lovers, of friends such as Belle and Marlon we're looking at here. And it was overwhelming in terms of how do I get my head around, like, say, all these images. But there was something intuitively that it was feeding in a way that there was a certain grounding element, if you will. And I remember Thomas Lax was one of the first, our friend and colleague, to come and by and look at the work. Also, I remember Gregory Cruz and Rob Sawyer invited me up to Yale to do a visit in the photo school. I had taught there a few years as a core critic in the painting and sculpture department, but I had never been to the photo department per se. And so I did a formal presentation, and then at the end I said, let me just show 50 of these slides. And we're talking about 2014, 15. And so I remember my initial idea was maybe to use the images as source material for collages, if you will. And I mean, it was just something I was thinking about along the lines of, let's say, The Watering Hole or some other montage-based work that I've been doing for a number of years. And then it was curious because the students there, they did not know, for example, in fact, some of them might have been in the crib or not even, or prenatal for that matter, how it may not have been born, yet when these images were taken. And so, but there was something about the freshness of the eye that they could identify. So, and it was curious to see how they were reading them. And then a few months later, I did my first, I guess, formal presentation of them. And that were 200 images that were shown on the occasion of Carrie Mae Weems Live at the Guggenheim. And it was a stark difference the way the reception that was at Yale, and that people were having an emotional response, because in a way that the images almost, or the momentum more, that it captured something that people had actually lived. I remember Elizabeth Alexander, crying because there was something about that the images, its aspect suggested that there was a time that had gone on, but a time that they can remember through the images itself. So that was 200 images to the soundtrack of Grace Jones, and I sort of did a sort of call and response, sort of like speaking to the images, so it was also a call and response, if you will, with the audience. So yes, so where are we?
Okay, so this is Black Popular Culture, which is the same one with that Cornel West and Marlon Riggs were in. And we see here the cross section you were talking about, right, with Faith Ringgold and Douglas Crimp and this rich intersection of different, I guess, identities, but also maybe political projects coming together. And I think this is one of the things that we spoke about is, something about this cultural memory, remembering that these alliances had been, and that all this stuff that that there's maybe ways for this archive to be an active agent in relation to the activism that's happening today, right? That's some kind of predecessor or just an example or some sort. So yeah, so I think this was part of our our conversations early on was how
Yes,
does this.
absolutely. I mean, another way to look at it, Gean, would just say that that the work that was done, that these images are in service, if you will, of the work that was done, as opposed to I think in the way they document,
Mhm.
these alliances or these, exchanges or these, connections or these um, um, child and I think in a way that perhaps the activism that's taking place is the inheritance of that discourse that actually rattled the academy, across the globe. So I think it's important to somehow say that as well. The fact that, yeah.
Yeah, and I was also wanted to put this, with Isaac Julian kind of already pointing to other geographies a little bit. I also thought that one of the things in the
Okay,
archive.
can you say that again?
I
Can you
was
say that
saying
again?
yeah, the photo with Isaac Julian is already kind of pointing at other geographies, and I thought it was really interesting in the archive that while it's quite, there's a huge New York presence or an American presence, it also starts reaching
Or
out.
London,
Right,
Paris, yeah,
right, but it also then opens all kinds of conversations, right? Because this is the
the
Stuart Hall that,
transatlantic, yes.
yeah, this is Stuart Hall also that's leaving behind kind of the cultural studies Gramscian thing and starting to think about
Mm.
diaspora and identities and it's almost like a second stage Stuart Hall. So this is also in the archive, right? Within there's these textures that are that if you start digging in, um, it's quite rich, and then it then ties to other moments, right? This ties to the Birmingham School now, and it's just this kind of great web of what I would call something like partisan knowledge production or something like that, right?
Can you unpack that for us, please? What does that mean?
Oh, I mean, I just think that we start seeing folks who are thinking very specifically, they're situating their knowledge production quite specifically, right? So Stuart Hall is he's coming out of a Marxist tradition, but the 90s are offering him new things to think about around diaspora, and folks like Isaac Julian, he's coming into the picture, and Stuart Hall has to start thinking through these younger artists and what they're saying about um, transatlantic production, what they're saying about immigrant children, what they're saying about all
Hmm.
these new, this, it's almost like there's a renewal of discourse too happening at this moment. And I think Stuart Hall is someone who's a good person to think of what is emerging at this time in the early 90s through. So yeah,
Well,
so I thought,
yeah, absolutely, highly, highly, foundational and
yeah.
influential. Yeah, I mean, it was curious to me when I first when I was in South Africa in soon after discovering the archive, I was doing a residency there, and there was a colleague of the former President Mbeki who came through the studio, and he could recognize, oh, there's John, there's Stuart. So it was interesting to me to go to South Africa and think, I mean, it's sort of echoing what you're saying, that it was a global discourse, you know what I'm saying? And maybe it might not just have resided in the academy, the fact that the discourse was, its influence was wide and impactful. And I'm interested in those moments so that one would encounter it, let's say, maybe in the academy, but also I'm interested in the everyday of encountering and those points of influence, and just thinking about how, since rediscovering of the archive, the fact that the work has been shown, let's say in South Africa, at Stevenson, to let's say then Miami, because this is the second iteration time in Miami. First show with David Castillo in 2015, then Sao Paulo. It wasn't South Africa that Gabi Nyoko actually saw the work, and then she, spoke with the director, and actually they invited me to go to Sao Paulo. So I'm interested in these, how the proliferation of these ideas, you know what I'm saying? But often it's in the academy, but also it might be over strawberries for breakfast, just showing
Mhm.
the slides, and someone says, oh, there's something in here that has meaning, and the fact that, and to see those images resonate, let's say in Brazil or Mexico City, or let's say Zurich. So I'm interested in those different spheres of, let's say, influence, but also how um, people are able to have multiple entry points, even if they do not know, let's say, the specificity of one particular person, that there's a certain affect that the images, particularly, let's say, in the installation might suggest. I'm curious. I was I was looking at Marlon Riggs' Tungsten Tide the other day. I was showing it in my class, and I had and I guess I had maybe the last time I saw it was maybe a year ago, and after my class is in the evening class, so after class ends at 9 p.m. So I wound up watching it again while I was cooking, and I actually, with the students not on Zoom, I actually had an emotional response just to see Marlon, Essex, and to hear the poetry of Donald Woods, etc., and to think about the level of urgency, but also how the film captured these, for me, revolutionary, men, queer men, Black queer men who were speaking to modes of resistance, and not only, let's say, homophobia, let's say, within the Black community, or like, racism in the larger community, or racism in the queer community, etc., and to see them in all of their fieriness and their beauty, and think the fact that that was like 30 years ago, and just thinking about the passage of time, and how the archive, for me, I don't know, there was something about that, to, I guess, experience them, if you will, or the representation of them, and and the work, but also to see them in that video. There was something that felt like, I don't know. I feel like it's like unfinished business, and I think maybe that for me speaks to the promise of the archive. I feel like I'm just getting started, in terms of like other ways in which to unpack, that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think two things you point out there. One is, the archive still has its own work to do in some sense, but also it's one of the things that maybe the exhibition doesn't zero in at the exhibition at the IZA doesn't zero in so much is on the kind of very personal dimension of the archive as well, right? So this is EK, right? Your friend at certainly
Well, IK Uday, the publisher, artist, renowned, um, fashionist, etc. Yes, yeah. So, what was your question now?
No,
Sorry.
no, I was just saying that one of the things that the exhibition doesn't do so much is point out that there's an archive of figures who have become very important in intellectual production, but it's also quite personal, right? It's also
I would say
your
it's highly
travels.
personal. Yeah,
It's
yeah.
your travels through this world, right? And so you see, even I guess one of the things I was thinking about before this talk was something along the lines of how age functions in this archive, right? There's folks that we recognize as kind of um, professionals already in their fields, but there's also these very young bodies that are coming through this archive. And it just has this effective dimension that it just opens the idea that, this radical production is produced around young bodies, right? Young people are in the midst of.
Well, I think we should be a little more specific. Since
Sure.
since you focus your focus to stop in this one. This is Christina, the great Christina Sharp on the right, and her partner at the time. I'm spacing her name, but her name is in the book. And this is a great image to stop on, because this was, unlike my grandfather, who when I received his archive, that in addition to the photographs, there were like scores of notes, where in each photograph was um, numbered and titled, had a label on it, that mine were, I mean, loosely organized, but I didn't have names, I was shooting and, putting them in drawers, etc., or however I stored them. But this was the last image that I knew who she was intuitively, but I could not identify. And I think it's important just to say that, this is Gay's Head and Martha's Vineyard. So I'm curious at my age now, and I don't really know the answer. I mean, getting back to saying before that, sharing similar spaces with people, whether that was going to parties or clubs, etc., that I knew her, but that I really know her. But then again, I did know her to the extent that we were, again, the whole thing, that's my face. The fact that being as being the radical feminist that she is, I mean, the fact that it wasn't like I stole the photograph. The fact that there was almost an intuitive, let's say, had, and that through the camera, through the connection, and she offered herself up to the extent that I offered myself to take the photograph. But it wasn't until right before the book went to print that Tavio came to the studio and he said, is that Christina? And then that is her. I realized who that was. So he actually took a picture of this photograph, sent it to her, and she, yes, identified it was her. And then we got in contact with her former partner, and we were able to get the actual names into the book. But it was something that it was vexing, because it was like, I know who this is, but I can't exactly remember from, like, say, 20, from close to 30 years ago. So that's the story. So I think within the archive, there's several images. So it wasn't like, say that, well, that's Christina Sharp, I'm going to go photograph her. I mean, maybe in the context of, let's say, the Black Pop culture, clearly I knew that was Angela Davis, or I knew people who I knew, or Isaac, or so it was interesting, the fact that what I love about this photo. I mean, it's about them, but it's also about Gay's Head. It's about what it meant for this young queer couple, this young queer Black lesbian couple, to occupy the space. Gay's Head, I mean, and Gay has this certain mythology within queer culture, but also yeah. So I'm interested in that.
So, and here's you around the same time, same age.
Say San Francisco, Gay Pride.
Yeah, so there's this, and so I thought we should drop a journal in here, just because this is also kind of this personal dimension, but it's also it's very porous, right? Because yeah, it's a personal journal, but the article is quite powerful and speaks quite to that moment, really pointedly, right?
Can you say more?
Oh, well, I mean, the article is Essex Hemphill, right? He's like an emblematic
Actually,
person of that moment.
it's an obit, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it speaks to that moment, speaks to yeah. And yet it's just the clipping in your journal, right? It's just this kind of collecting of your personal information. So I just think that this personal and public thing is quite porous too in the archive. And when you feel you're digging into the most personal part of it, all of a sudden this very public document appears, right? So it's quite interesting to see. Yeah, I think what is really beautiful about the archive is this precisely, right? That it's this moment where you think it's a document that is just kind of documenting a scene, and all of a sudden you realize it's the middle of someone's life. And once you start seeing that it's the middle of someone's life, it just zooms back out, and it's just a cultural moment, right? An important cultural moment again. And there's this kind of weaving and organic movement, right? It's like a life. The life itself is somehow diagrammed between these very personal, private things and how it moves in the world. And I think it's just, it's just, it just seems quite poignant in relation to the kinds of experiences we have these days, when we're sometimes maybe tied to our screens and the information comes to us. It's almost like some kind of a critical memory reminder that there's other
So
ways to be in
tell
the
us,
world.
I mean, since you have been on site, if you will, so what has been the experience of people encountering the work
Uh, so I
at the
think,
museum?
yeah, I think folks have been engaging it. I have a lot of questions, and I think they linger over the journals. The journals are kind of on these vitrines; they're not really kind of accessible, but people do kind of, sit with them and try to like read things like this, right, when they're on display. So yeah, I think this has been the experience. Okay, so the black male, which is obviously a really important moment too in the culture, and I think I want to just think about this image, but also I think we should put it in relation to this image, and just think of like the larger, economic and class backgrounds that also are at play here. And on that prod, you can take it away.
I mean, what are you saying? I would like for you to take a deep dive. And what are you
No,
thinking?
I just think that there's this, that there's a complexity in this moment too, where, yeah, there's a lot of new radical intellectual production being done, but there's also like an entrenched class system around all this, right? And I think these two photographs, or this photograph and other photographs from that dinner, start pointing to these social, deeply entrenched, um, durable class structures that even in the midst of radical production reassert themselves, or highlight themselves in just by putting two photos side by side.
Yes, yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, so I was thinking that those two, and then this, I think, would be along the same lines, right? It's a way to kind of um, pull back and think of all this radical production, but also think of the complicated social field, right? So this is Rodney King time, right? This is a very complicated moment. This is the beginning of the crime bills, right, of the Clinton years. This is in the background, right, brewing. So I think you know, I think it's really important to have these images too, where we see the production, we see the producers, but we also kind of get this glimpse at the larger background and how sometimes nefarious it really was.
Yeah, I
And,
agree.
and I think in that sense, it starts to build resonance, like much more direct resonance with our current moment, right? You start seeing that it's this radical production was being done in relation to bodies being destroyed in the street. So I think in this way, the archive also becomes, still it does some, it's doing its work or something, as a tool, as a kind of active agent for contemporary activism and contemporary radical production, right? Radical thought and that sort of thing. So
Yeah, and also as a counter memory, if you think about, the the stereotypical reading of, let's say, if you think of the Crips and the Bloods, I mean, that's why it's important to have this photograph, but also in the context of the book. And this photograph was, I was a still photographer for Marlon Riggs's posthumous film, Black Is Black Ain't. And I mean, it was an extraordinary experience of going and actually I was living in LA at the time, and going and actually shooting these communities coming together as a way to offer other narratives around, let's say, community, etc. In fact, in the book that I did with Appleship, Today I Should Judge Nothing That Occurs, I specifically, asked Clarence Otis, who's a dear friend and patron, to write about the photographs, and he wrote a beautiful essay referring to a letter that he had received from his mother. I mean, he's from Compton, and he wound up going to Yale, Williamson, Yale, I believe, and then. And his mother wrote him a letter that there were these groups that were forming together as a way to think about community. And so, and that was the Crips and the Blood. So here you have this photograph that documents this coming together, but the the mainstream narrative, which is one of violence or one of. So I'm interested in how the photograph can offer a counter memory and speak to that. And with the two previous images, I mean, it is a curious juxtaposition between the black, the waiters at the black male exhibition. Go back, please. Um,
yeah.
in terms of we'll go back one more. In
Yes.
terms of Carrie Mae Weems was like Kay, and then Sharon, the collector Sharon and patient Sharon Bowen, and then the next photograph over to actually document these men who were there, who were waiters, as it says, but also to think about their own sense of style and embodiment, etc. And I love that tension, that the photograph can offer that evidence, and also in a way mirrors my own multiple identifications within that particular scenario, whether as the artist or the artist who's making work in the first photograph you showed, or the one there mentioned. Does that make any sense? So in a way that the camera becomes a way that I even negotiate that sphere of, let's say, the Black bourgeoisie. Does that make any sense? Even though I'm in the show, how does the camera itself become a way, or even the insertion, if you will, to document this particular two men as a way to offer multiple valences, how you might read that the hermetically sealed Black bourgeoisie with all of its maybe richness. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and then I just loaded up a few previous iterations of this, which are quite different from the ICA, just to kind of show the diversity of ways it's been presented.
Well, I think it's also important to somehow say there have been two trajectories, through the archive. I remember had an early meeting with Eva Raspini, and she was saying, well, there is early on, saying that there is the archive, meaning the images, then there's what is the work that comes out of that. And I didn't quite get that at first. And, it took me a few years in terms of like applying pressure to the content, if you will. But since the inception, that's why I love the ICA iteration, because in a way it the continuation of one trajectory. If there were, let's say, if there's two, there's one, a much more installation, operatic, intervention, engagement with the archive that began in Sao Paulo, then the Whitney, then Madrid, then the Pompidou, then Mexico City. But then there's a second iteration that started, let's say, with showing at David Castillo, let's say in 2015, and then South Africa, and then at Bard, for the picture industry show, and then now at the ICA. So I'm interested in how this one archive and how they have different modalities of somehow excavating and the representing of the work, and how one experiences both spatially, but also, So.
Great. So I think we should maybe open to questions before we run out of time. Okay.
Yes, sounds good.
Let me figure out how to do this.
Do we want to? There's one of also the late Maurice Berger.
I can
Do you
show
want to
that.
show that one?
I can. Well, we'll do a slow roll. Yes, so I think one of the...
And I should say Maurice Berger, and also Papa Colo from the back of Exit Art fame.
Yeah.
Did you recognize him before I said that?
I didn't, no. I didn't. So yeah, so I think this is our little closing tribute to Maurice, who's no longer with us. But I think we're open to questions. I can leave this image up as we talk.
Or yes, let's do it.
Okay. Any questions? We can start seeing folks now.
We can.
Lyle, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can.
It's Luis. I haven't seen you in at least 4 or 5 years. I think maybe the last time you were leading a yoga class in upstate New York. And I saw that you were doing this talk with the ICA. I'm now here in Miami. I actually went to the ICA.
Hi, how are you?
I am good. I'm good. I'm so proud of you. So happy to get to know your work a little better.
Great.
Where are you physically right now?
I'm upstate, Hudson Valley.
You're in Hudson Valley. Well, I'm sad you're
Yes.
not in Miami. My heart lit up when I thought I was going to see you today, but I just wanted to pop in and say hello and tell you that I love you and I admire your work and that I hope I get to see you soon,
Oh,
post-COVID,
thank you, thank
at
you.
some point.
Well, hopefully when Gean brings me down to Miami, you'll still be around.
Beautiful. Yeah. If that happens, I'll definitely come to see you. Thank you, Gean.
Okay then, take
Thank you,
care.
Luis.
Take care.
Yeah. Well, other questions? There's so many smart people in the audience.
Well, why don't you ask a question? Why don't you select someone to ask a question? You can always do that.
No, that feels very class structure.
Well,
Like classroom structure, I mean.
I'll ask a question.
There you
Hi,
go.
I'm Judy Black. Hi, Lyle. I first learned of you through the Studio Museum in Harlem, where I was on the
hi, how are
acquisition
you?
committee for several years.
Oh,
And then
wonderful.
I remember meeting you in person at Dawn Davis's surprise birthday party for her husband, Mac.
Oh,
Remember that
fantastic!
years ago?
Fantastic. Of course. We're so happy for Dawn, aren't we?
Yes, we are.
Yeah, we were together this summer in the vineyard or in August. Yes, for a little bit.
And I saw a few of my friends in your pictures, like Sharon Bowen, very good friend of mine.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
I guess I want to ask you, when did you first realize that, you know, being an artist was what you wanted to make your career, and how did you support yourself? Because as we know, artists don't make a lot of money in the beginning until they really become recognized. So how did you make that decision and that commitment? I'm interested to hear more about that.
Oh, interesting. Curious question. Well, it's curious. I mean, maybe I'll try and answer it. I left Wesleyan, left the East Coast to go to Cal Arts, and in a way that it was sort of the end of innocence, if you will. Once you get into a graduate program. So while I was there, as I mentioned, I met a bunch of people, and there was an exciting time to be working. And there was I was showing, and I was very fortunate enough to show while I was in grad school. In fact, my first show was the constructs that was shown. That there was an exhibition in London that autograph the very important um, very important platform of featuring Black photography in the diaspora. They had their inaugural show was in London '89, and I think John Comfort and Isaac had told them about my work. So that was my first show. They put me in the cover. There was also at the time on the cover of 10/8 magazine. So in a lot of ways that my work was, I guess, was getting out there while I was still in grad school, so I would say. But I've taught for a number of years. I've been fortunate enough to teach, and
Okay, so you were able to make the transition while you were in school, and then you supplemented with teaching.
Well, I would say maybe supplement is not the right word. I would say that a lot of, I think I see teaching as a form of, let's say, artistic production or an artistic engagement. You know what I'm saying? I'm a full professor at NYU now, but I would say that that's equally, I mean, it has its challenges, of course, but that for me is part of the work of, let's say, knowledge production or engaging with community, et cetera. In fact, the archive that's currently at the ICA right now, I don't think it would have happened in the way that it did without having direct connection with students, who were able to offer. In fact, a former she wasn't a student of mine, but she's from NYU. I remember I had applied for Guggenheim for many, many years. And because of my formal background, that I was maybe presenting the archive in a way that was almost too formal. And she was like, well, this is straight up Black Lives Matter. So I actually, I draw on, the energy of the youth to somehow to find other ways of thinking about modernity, thinking about, culture, thinking about accessing one voice, etc. In the manner that Bell Hooks was, taught me many, many years ago. So I would say that teaching was an integral part of that, but also, doing portraits, as you know, our friends in common, the Dawn's portrait, from Jackie and Clarence's portrait, etc. Renowned portraitists, etc. So I think there's a different ways in which, that let's find a way of engaging, let's say, the public, so.
Got it.
Does that make sense, Judy?
Absolutely.
I appreciate it. It's good to see you.
So I think we have time for one last question.
Okay.
Hi, Lyle. We know each other through a common connection in Provincetown, and I followed your work in several ways, including through the Albert Marola Gallery. We
Okay,
interviewed once on the
Jim and
phone.
Al, yes.
It's
yes.
great. It's always great to hear you. We're connected also
Yeah.
to the Fine Arts Work Center. This was a great discussion. Thank you so much. The only comment I would have, I guess, from an arts journalist perspective, is when we talk about your images, I don't want people to overlook the fact that they are works of art in themselves and show all the attributes of really excellently designed and executed artworks. So aside from the political and psychological and socio-sexual discussions, when I look at an image like the Crips and the Bloods, and I see the purple seats, and I see the perfect angle of photographing, I really think of, as I said, high art as well as all of the political things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think one can really separate the two without question. That
No.
One of the things
that should not be forgotten as part of the discussion.
and I it's interesting, Susan, because when I was, as I mentioned earlier, when I first showed the work, when Gregory Cruz and Rob Shaw invited me to Yale, the students were engaged in work purely formal. There was something they found fresh about that. So I am interested in multiple access points, etc. But without question, there would not be, for me personally, there would not be the work if there wasn't that, obviously, that informal engagement. But with that said, the content is something, there is a dialogic relationship between both, which is equally important for me. But in that photograph you referred to, that Gean and I are talking about, it is in terms of the political dimension, but what's also about how those young men who were being framed a certain type of way in the press, how they fashioned their body. If you look at, you said the acid green or the acid yellow, the fact that there is, if you think about Angela Davis in terms of Black, in terms of her agency, in terms of like Black liberation, in terms of being the most wanted woman, on the FBI, how out of that type of state violence, there was the birth of, let's say, Black power, which was also an aesthetic as well as a political dimension that one can never separate that. Or Fidel Castro, or, even think about, Hitler would not exist without the triumph of the will. If you think about the aesthetics around, authoritarianism, et cetera, that aesthetics are always involved in the political realm. So I think it's important to talk about that.
Thank you, that was great. I appreciate that, and so does everybody else.
Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned Jim and Al, because they were actually the first, Jim and Al from Marola Gallery, who good friends of mine, close friends. And it was because after David Castillo, they showed in Provincetown, and the works did very, very well there. So, and they first saw the works early, in fact, soon after, they saw the work soon after in the city. They came in, and
yes.
It's interesting because even before they traveled to South Africa, the fact that these are two friends, dealers in Provincetown, the fact that they saw something that was fresh and energetic in the work, and
yes.
so you
had that residency at 20 Summers.
Exactly. Of course.
Yeah. You see,
It's-
I've been following, as
we
many,
must.
many people do.
Well, very nice to see you.
Thank you
Well,
so much. This is beautiful.
Okay.
well, fantastic. I think we've run out of
Gean,
time, but
I'm sure we have one closing question, don't we?
do we? We could take a closing question.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Joanne. Well, I've known you for a long, long time, and it always fascinates me
Family, family,
because
family.
because the fact that you are a young an artist of color, and you have been able to get your work all over the world, which is unusual from one continent to another. What has the aggressiveness, your books, your work, your photography? What has been what motivates you to do? I didn't hear the beginning of the discussion. It was like I'm old and not able to always get on quickly. But what motivates you to do all these things and to be able to be exhibited in museums worldwide and see you in New York Times, art magazines? It's incredible.
Well, I think, I was, thank you for the question, Joanna. I was very much inspired by my grandfather, as I mentioned to you, as I spoke about earlier. I think it's just what we do as artists, you know what I'm saying? I think it's a way of communicating and just really being true to oneself, and I think any artist, but I think, having the experience of as a child living abroad was super important to me, getting outside of the American context, traveling to Europe, traveling to Africa, having those experiences that I think photography was a way to somehow capture those moments along the journey. So, and I've been blessed to be able to share them. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Well, thank you, Lyle. I think this was fantastic, and we should close by inviting everyone to come to the ICA. We're open. You can see
Oh,
all-
please! I hope people will
Yeah.
definitely come and see the show.
Folks in Miami are visiting this holiday. We're open, and the work is there, and it looks amazing. So, thank you, Lyle. And thank you, everyone,
Thank you,
for
everyone.
joining us.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.